Hey everybody, welcome back to VFX Together. My name is Matt. Today we're going to be taking a look at some tips and tricks for integrating, in this case a logo, into some live action footage and making it look pretty realistic. Alright, so pretty simple, just some basic motion, but there's a few things going on here that are really making this logo look like it's really part of the scene. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's jump into a new comp, and I've just got our footage layer. And you see it's pretty basic. It's just a simple dolly camera move. But we have some complex things in the scene. We have some motion in the middle with this little ant, and we have some depth of field that we want to make sure that we match with our logo. So we're going to start off by just bringing our logo right on top. And you can see that it's basically has nothing to do with this scene. The colors aren't right, the perspective's not right. It's in fact just kind of a standard logo. It's something we're going to have to work on to make it look a little bit more like it's supposed to be in the scene. So first thing we're going to do is see if we can get the border to match something like a scratched off bark. That's kind of what I've got here. The idea is that the bark has been maybe whittled off, and that this is part of that interior wood layer. So first thing I'm going to do is just come up here to the ellipse tool, double click it, and we will just kind of play with the handles a little bit until we get something that looks more organic. So I'm going to kind of just work with the lines of the logo, make sure that we can get something that still holds all the text, but maybe has a little bit of a unique look. Okay, so I like that pretty well. It's not perfect, but it will. It's not supposed to be perfect. We're doing something natural and organic, so we want it to be just kind of randomized. So next thing I'm going to do is come over here to Effects and Presets, and I'm going to type in Roughen Edges. This effect is pretty cool. It adds a little bit of a more randomized border. You can see as I pull this up, it starts eating away in a pretty natural way to the border of the mask or of the matte, depending on your image. If this had transparency, it would work with that too. That's pretty good. I'm going to bring the mask in on this side just a little bit because we're seeing the border there. Okay, so that'll work pretty well for our purposes. Now, what I want to do is try and get the colors on this to match the colors of the tree bark. And there's a few ways we could do this. Obviously, we could do a tint effect, and we can, maybe add some browns in that way. The problem with doing it this way, I mean, it works fine, and in a lot of cases it might be all you need, but we don't get a lot of control. Everything is affected equally. And I want something that's a little bit more colorful, even though we're just dealing with kind of a brown palette. I want something that's going to pop a little bit more. So I'm going to use an effect called Colorama. Now, a lot of people don't really know or understand how powerful this tool is, because whenever you're just testing it out, you throw it on and you get kind of this psychedelic effect, and everybody's like, okay, well that's nice. I mean, maybe it'll work for heat vision and stuff like that, but it's really a lot more powerful than people understand. So the way it works is we've got an input. It's called input phase, but basically all this means is what channel or what properties of the layer are you using. So we can use the red, green, and blue channel. We can use the hue or the lightness or the saturation or the value. And I'm going to go with value right here. And what that does is basically if you convert everything to black and white, that's essentially what value gives you. The darker colors are lower values, the lighter colors are higher values. And then the output cycle says, okay, how am I going to take those values and apply them in some way to change, in this case, the color? And so what I'm going to do here is go down to Sepia, and you can kind of pick one that works. So I'm going to go with Sepia 2. And right away, we can see that we maintain a lot of the contrast, we maintain a lot of the shading, and we do it in a much just more visually interesting way than if we were just doing it with a tint or a hue saturation shift or something like that. So that's looking pretty good. The last thing I want to do is try and match the perspective. So there are a few ways we could do this. One way that you might think about doing, if you are, depending on the type of logo, we could turn this into a 3D layer. Just click this little box down here, and we could actually try and rotate it and match a real-life perspective. So that's an option. We can do it that way. And that'll look pretty good. I'm not going to do it that way, though, because I want to be able to apply a few more modifiers and have them work more naturally the way that I do it. So I'm going to turn that off, and instead I'm just going to add an effect, distort, corner pin. And corner pin works, it works like the perspective transform in Photoshop and things like that. What I actually want to do is try and make it look like the initial perspective in the logo itself wasn't there. I want to try and kind of make it look like this originally was just a flat logo with the text all the same size and all the same perspective, and then shift the perspective the opposite direction. So we're actually kind of double adjusting for the original perspective in the logo, and then now the perspective in the camera. So I'm going to go back to this new composition, and I'm just going to really stretch out this right side of it so that visually it looks like we kind of get rid of a lot of that perspective. That looks pretty good, but it's still really flat. And the tree bark that this is on is a little bit more cylindrical. It's kind of curved along with the tree. So I want to try and match that a little bit. And so what I'm going to add here is another distort modifier, and we are going to add a bulge modifier. Now, bulge basically just does exactly what it sounds like. It kind of increases distortion in a circular way. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to crank the radius on both of these way up. And as you can see, as I do this, we can adjust how much that curve affects the logo. So I'm going to find a good curve that makes it look a little bit more like it is on the tree. Okay, so if I'm happy with that, then now the next step is going to be to track this logo to the background footage. Now, if I solo this background, I want you to keep an eye on the left and right areas, especially this area right in here. As I scrub forward here, you can see that it's very subtle, but there is a perspective change. This kind of gets bunched up a little bit because some of it's further away from the camera, which means that if we do a standard just position track, we find a good point, position track it, that the logo, because it's so large, it is going to start getting off along the edges. But fortunately, we do have a tool in Adobe After Effects that comes along with it called Mocha AE that can account for perspective changes like this. So I'm just going to select my background footage layer, go up to Animation, Track in Mocha AE. Now I have Mocha Pro installed, but Mocha AE that comes with After Effects, it does do exactly the same thing, so don't worry too much about that. So now we've got our footage imported into Mocha. I'm going to go up here to create an X-spline. You can create an X-spline or a Bezier spline. Bezier splines work exactly like masks in Adobe, and X-splines are just a little bit quicker because rather than having control points in the center of the line, they have them at the corners, and you can kind of just adjust as necessary. In our case, we don't really need to adjust anything. We are just tracking a segment of the screen. So we're just going to create that spline. We're going to make sure perspective is checked at the bottom under the motion tracking panel, and then we're going to track forward. And you'll notice as it goes, the nice kind of really intelligent thing that Mocha can do is small amounts of motion in the center, like this ant, are ignored. It can figure out that the majority of the frame is moving in the same way. And so it doesn't actually get confused by small amounts of motion. If there were something larger here, you can create a new layer and exclude that, a new layer spline. You can exclude that from the track. So it's very powerful, but in this case, we don't even need to use that. Okay, so now that this is done, you can see that the spline tracks pretty well, and it is following the perspective shifts. If you look at this line, if you look at this line on the left and the right, you'll see that as the perspective changes, they stay pretty well lined up with the features that are underneath them. So that should work pretty well. So I'm going to show you kind of what Mocha is doing. So here, this blue square, imagine that this is whatever the footage is that we're trying to comp onto our background. And this grid is going to show us how the distortion and the perspective is changing. So if I put this, and this doesn't really matter for the track, it's completely separate, it's just kind of a visual indication. If I line this up to the tree, so we can see kind of how the plane of that track is, and I scrub backward, and so you can see as I scroll a little bit, it's very subtle, but that grid stays perfectly aligned to the features that are underneath it. So that's pretty good. I'm going to click this little button over here, which is going to set the boundaries of my blue square to match the screen. And that's important if we're dealing with something in After Effects, because After Effects doesn't know that its own layer is supposed to be distorted. So we want to start out square and allow the Mocha tracking information to distort that our original plate, our original layer, the way it needs to. So we're going to click that, make sure that our boundary is set to the size of the screen, and then we're going to export tracking data, and we're going to select After Effects corner pin supports motion blur and copy that to the clipboard. Okay. Now, it's very important that you remember where you set the screen size for that boundary, because whatever frame you set that on, that's the frame you need to work on in After Effects to make sure that frame looks good before you apply the track to everything else. So in our case, I'm starting our distortion, our distortion is even on the very last frame. There's no distortion on the very last frame of the video, if that makes sense. I'm on the last frame in Mocha, so it matches the screen size. I go back to After Effects, I go to the last frame in After Effects, and I make sure that this footage that I'm distorting is going to line up where I want it. So that looks pretty good. And now I want to apply the distortion to that layer. Important thing to remember though, this layer, you can see the boundaries here, this layer is not the same size as this comp, which means Mocha is expecting that this image that we're distorting is the same size as the comp. If I just apply it, if I go to Edit, Paste, you see everything's off. The size is off, the position's off, it's not working. So what we need to do first is pre-compose this. And we're going to move everything into that composition. So now we have a frame that looks good, a composition that's the same size as our comp. So now we can paste it in. We just go to the beginning because it's going to paste keyframes, and After Effects always pastes keyframes from the point of the playhead. So we're going to go to the beginning, press Control-V, Command-V on the Mac, and immediately you'll see everything gets offset. And now, as we scrub forward, it tracks perfectly in perspective with everything in the background. So we're getting pretty close. This is starting to, it definitely looks integrated in terms of it looks like it's attached to that tree. We've got a few other things going on here though. We've got depth of field, and we've got this little ant. Let's go ahead and deal with the depth of field first. So there are a couple of different ways that we could do this. We could apply some masks and some fast blurs or Gaussian blurs or something like that. I want to show you something that's a little bit more flexible. So you'll notice here, we've got this center kind of area, this third of the screen that is very much in focus, and then we've got where the focus falls off at the edges. What I want to do is create a way to tell After Effects how this lens focus is set up, so that if I wanted to use more than one layer, or if I wanted to have items that are animated in from the sides of the screen or things like that, I want to make sure that it all follows the same focus. So what we're going to do is create a blur map that we can then apply to one item or the whole screen or whatever we want to do, and that will tell After Effects how to blur in a way that matches the depth of field. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new solid. We're going to call this blur map. And then I'm going to apply an effect, generate light sweep. And so it just basically creates a gradient of white in the center of a black field. We can adjust the angle, we can adjust the width, and we can adjust the brightness. So I'm going to bring up the brightness quite a bit, and I'm going to bring the opacity down. And I'm just going to try and adjust this to where the white part of the image is in focus, is the area underneath that's in focus, and the black part of the image is the area that is out of focus. And we get that nice gradient in the middle. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose this, move all the attributes into the new composition, and then I'm going to hide that layer. Okay, so now we've got a blur layer, a blur map that's going to drive some sort of blur that we want to apply. If you notice though, the blur, because the camera is moving, the area of the screen that is in focus is also moving. So here's where we can use a very simple motion tracker. Find a spot, find the very center of where your image is in focus, and we're just going to track that forward. We'll go back to our composition, create a new null object, go back to our tracker, edit target, select the null, click OK, click apply, X and Y dimensions. And so now we have a null object that is following the point of focus. So we are going to copy that, go into our blur map, and paste it. We can bring up the position information on the null, go to our blur center point, alt-click on the stopwatch, and then pick whip the light sweep center to follow the motion of the null object, and then click away. So now we have a moving blur map that matches the motion of the camera. So we right-click, go to Blur and Sharpen, and I'm going to use a camera lens blur. Go to our blur map layer, select our blur map comp, and then we're going to take a look at what it's done. We might need to invert it. In our case, it looks like we do need to invert it. Okay, we're looking pretty close. The edges of the logo are blurred, the center is not, but it's not quite lined up. The reason for that is that the blur map is applying within the bounds of our logo comp and not within our main comp. So the way we can get around that is we're just going to remove that camera lens blur. We're going to pre-compose our logo again. We're going to call this distorted tracked logo. Move everything into that comp and then apply the lens blur and then apply the blur map. Now we can see that our map, which has the blur right in the center, is lined up. The parts of our logo that are in focus are the same as the parts of our background that are in focus. And as we play forward, you can see that the blur stays perfectly with the logo. Now in this case, there's not a lot of lens change. So as I mentioned before, you could definitely just create some masks and adjustment layers and do a manual blur, and you'd only have to set it up once. The whole thing is going to move together and the focus is going to remain the same. But this is a very flexible option. So if you've got a camera that is changing its focus, changing its depth of field, it's a variable lens, maybe it's focusing on something real close and then something very far away, and you want to match that without having to do a complete 3D lens track and all that kind of thing, you can do, this is a very powerful way to animate that same lens change just based on a simple blur map. So keep that in mind. It's very flexible, it's very powerful, and it can give you some really great results. So we're getting pretty close now. The next thing I want to do is try and bring that ant on top of our logo layer. So there are a few ways that we can do this. One option would be to go in and create some masks and rotoscope the whole ant, track him, get a really clean mat and pull it and then just put it on top. If you are going to be a major perfectionist, like let's say this was going in a theater and it's going to be filmed in 6K and you're going to be able to see the ant like that big, maybe that would be a good option. In our case, it's HD footage, it's not that detailed, and it's really not the focus of the video. So I'm going to use a faster and easier method because in the world of visual effects, whatever works, works. There's no right or wrong way. It just is a matter of what it looks like at the end. And the faster and most efficient way you can do that, the quicker you're going to be able to pull off shots, the less stress you're going to have, and the better you're going to and the better reputation you're going to have for being able to do this. So I'm going to do it a quick and easy way. I'm going to duplicate the layer and bring this up to the top. And then I'm just going to throw an extract effect on. We're going to bring, let me go ahead and solo this just so we can see what we're doing. We're going to bring down the white point until we get about where we want. I'm going to bring up the softness. Next thing I'm going to do is just add a quick channel blur on the alpha channel and increase that just a little bit. Quick repeat pixels. So in my case, I want some of that bark texture to start coming through. In other cases, that may not be a perfect way. You may want to try and do something a little bit more precise. You may have to create, at the very least, a garbage mat around the ant and animate that and track it. But in my case, because I want a lot of this detail, I'm perfectly fine with an imperfect extraction mat. Now, the one thing that I do want to do, because extract is working on the luminance value, this kind of shiny part on the ant's abdomen is going transparent. So that I will need to, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the layer. I'm going to take the extract modifier off, and I'm going to go in and quickly animate a mask around here. And this does not need to be perfect, because all we're trying to do is just kind of fill in the shiny part of the ant's body. So I'm skipping a lot of keyframes. I'm being really, really sloppy with this. But you'll see here in a minute that it really doesn't matter. It's going to be believable enough. Okay, so I just did that, and I did that in real time, right? It did not take me more than 20 seconds. And we've got a pretty good ant crawling on top of the logo. And we did not have to pull keys. We did not have to do any kind of tedious rotoscoping. We did it all in a manner of about a minute and a half. And so we could feather this a little bit and maybe clean it up if we really wanted to. But that's looking pretty good. So the last thing that I want to do is I want to make this logo pop a little bit more, make it look a little bit more 3D, make it look a little bit more tree-like. And so what I'm going to do on that is, first thing is I'm going to go inside our logo. And I'm going to apply a couple of effects. I'm going to apply a layer style, inner shadow, and I'm going to increase the distance so that we get a little bit of kind of just a sense that this is sitting interior to the bark of the tree. And I'm going to apply another layer style, bevel and emboss. I'm going to make it an inner bevel, down a down-facing inner bevel, and we're going to make this chisel hard. And then we're just going to scale the size down a little bit, but that'll give us a little bit of some highlights just to show that there's a direction change on the edges. It's going to give it a little bit of thickness. So now we'll go back to our comp. And right away, you can see that it is much better integrated. You can see that this really looks like it's an edge, like the bark has some thickness now, and it's looking pretty good. So I'm going to duplicate this layer. I'm going to set the bottom layer to multiply. And I'm going to take the top layer and bring the opacity down just a little bit. So now, as you can see, we have our logo integrated incredibly well with our background footage. It looks like it is part of the tree. It has things going on underneath it. It has things going on top of it. And it just makes for a very cool effect. And you can use this, of course, for other things. Let's say you wanted, rather than a logo, maybe you had a line drawing, a sketch of a carving or something that you wanted to put in a tree or a rock or anything, or the side of a mountain. You can use these effects and really integrate these well. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it showed you a few techniques that you can use in your own videos. If you have any questions or if you have any ideas for new tutorials, I hope you'll leave them in the comments. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, please subscribe, and we'll see you next time.